Hello, welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this microfiche time capsule, we are looking back at the Juvenile Instructor from the 1st of February 1900. So this one is entitled Lives of Our Leaders, the Apostles, Joseph F. Smith. We are continuing this series, and this was a series of biographical articles, which I find very interesting. They started with the First Presidency and then moved to the Quorum of the 12, and I believe they also did the Presiding Bishopric and a couple other groups. So I'm interested to see who all made the cut, so to speak. The Presidency of the 70, I think. Anyways, I found it very interesting. So Joseph F. Smith, I believe, was the second counselor in the First Presidency at the time. So let's take a look. It was John Locke, the great characteristic English philosopher, who, at the age of 30, wrote, "I no sooner perceived myself in the world, but I found myself in a storm which has lasted hitherto." To Joseph F. Smith, who is among the greatest and most unique and notable individuals of that peculiar people, the Latter-day Saints, this sentence of Locke's is especially applicable. Only his life was enveloped in storm before he could perceive. He is the son of Hyrum Smith, the second patriarch of the church, the brother of the prophet Joseph. His mother was Mary Fielding, and of English origin, a woman of bright and strong mind and of excellent business and administrative qualities. It was during the Missouri troubles. Governor Boggs had issued his order to exterminate the Mormons. On the first day of November, 1838, through the heartless treachery of Colonel Hinkle, Joseph and Hyrum and several other leaders of the people were betrayed into the hands of an armed mob under General Clark. They were to be taken prisoners and confined in jail and perhaps shot. On the day following, these betrayed leaders were given a few moments to bid farewell to their families. Under a strong guard of militia mobocrats, Hyrum was marched to his home in Far West, and at the point of the bayonet, with oaths and curses, was ordered to take his last farewell of his wife, for his doom was sealed, and he was told that he would never see her again. Imagine such a shock to his companion. It would have overpowered and come near ending the life of an ordinary person. Would it, though? That's a bit of an exaggeration. Of course, it would be extremely upsetting. However, close to ending the life, that's a bit overly dramatic. That's very literary. Yeah, Mary Fielding was not a literary character. She was a living, breathing human being, so I just don't feel like her life was in danger by hearing this news. I'm just saying, sorry, don't exaggerate, people. It was a little much. But with the natural strength of her mind, coupled with the sustaining care of God, she was upheld in this fiery trial with its added miseries to follow. It was on the 13th day of the same month of November, 1838, in the midst of plunderings and scenes of severest hardship and persecution, that she gave birth to her firstborn, who was named Joseph Fielding Smith. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that he was not named after Joseph Smith. He was named after Joseph Fielding, who was Mary Fielding's father, yes. If I am not mistaken. In the cold of the following January, leaving 4 little ones under the care of her sister Mercy R., children of her husband by a former wife then dead, she journeyed in a wagon with her infant to Liberty Jail in Clay County, where the husband and father was confined, without trial or conviction, his sole offense being that he was a Mormon. She was permitted to visit him in jail, but was later compelled to continue her flight from Missouri with her children to seek shelter in Illinois. Yeah, Mary Fielding was his second wife, but I believe that he was not yet practicing plural marriage at that point, or, yeah. So, his first wife was, I believe, named Jerusha, if I'm not mistaken, and they had 4 children together, and then he and Mary Fielding had Joseph Fielding Smith together. So that's what happened there. So yeah, when Mary Fielding was his second wife, but she was the stepmother to his 4 children, who were still quite small. They were still needed care. Such were the stormy environments of birth, and such was the first pilgrimage of the infant Joseph, who has since compassed the earth and islands of the sea, promulgating and defending the principles for which his father endured imprisonment and later martyrdom, and for which his mother suffered untold persecution and distress. Joseph's early years were spent amidst the agitations which culminated in the martyrdom of his uncle and his father on the memorable 27th day of June, 1844. After the abandonment of the city by the 12, and when the majority of the saints had been driven from Nauvoo, in September 1846, his mother fled from the city and camped on the west side of the Mississippi River, among the trees on its banks without wagon or tent, during the bombardment of the city by the mob. Having later succeeded in making exchanges of property in Illinois for teams and an outfit, she set out for winter quarters on the Missouri River. Joseph, a lad of only about 8 years, drove a yoke of oxen and a wagon most of the distance through the state of Iowa to winter quarters, and his other occupation after leaving Nauvoo was principally that of herd boy. So he was already working at age 8. It's crazy. Child labor laws, people. Okay. On these western plains he drank in the freedom of the spirit of the West and developed that physical strength which, notwithstanding his later sedentary occupation, is still observable in his robust, erect, and muscular form. I didn't know he was particularly muscular, but that's interesting to me. He is a lover of strength and a believer in work. Labor is the key to the true happiness of the physical and spiritual being. If a man possesses millions, his children should still be taught how to labor with their hands. Boys and girls should receive a home training which will fit them to cope with the practical daily affairs of family life, even where the conditions are such that they may not have to do this work themselves. They will then know how to guide and direct others, said he, in a recent conversation with the writer. The great and overpowering desire of all the saints was to obtain means to gather to the valley. For this purpose, various kinds of labor was sought in Iowa in neighboring states, from farming to school teaching. In the fall of 1847, he drove a team for his mother to St. Joseph, for the purpose of securing provisions and make the coveted journey to the Salt Lake Valley in the spring following. The trip was successfully made. It was in the fall of that year, while tending his mother's cattle near winter quarters, that he experienced one of the most exciting incidents of his life. The cattle were their only hope of means for immigration to the valley. The fact was deeply impressed upon the boy, so that he came to view them as a precious heritage, as well as a priceless charge given to him as a herd boy. He understood the responsibility, and that is much, for neither Joseph the boy nor Joseph the man was ever known to shirk a duty or prove recreant to a responsibility. One morning, in company with Alden and Thomas Burdick, he set out upon the usual duties of the day. The cattle were feeding in the valley some distance from the settlement, which valley was reached in 2 ways, one over a bench or plateau, the other through a ravine or small canyon. The boys had each a horse. Joseph's was a bay mare, swifter than the others. Alden suggested that Thomas and Joseph go the short route to the left, over the bench, and they would go up the canyon on the right, so that they would meet in the valley from the 2 directions. The suggestion was gladly adopted, and the 2 set out with youthful frolic, and soon arrived at the upper end of the valley, where the cattle could be seen feeding by a stream which divided it in the center, and wound down the canyon from the direction of the settlement. Having the day before them, they amused themselves with running their horses, and later in jumping them over a little gully in the upper part of the valley. And they were soon engaged in this amusement. Suddenly, a band of 20 or 30 Indians came into view, around a point in the lower end of the valley, some distance below the cattle. Thomas first saw them, and frantically yelled, "Indians!" at the same time turning his horse for the bend to ride for home. Joseph started to follow, but the thought came to his mind, "My cattle! I must save my cattle!" From that moment only this thought filled his mind. Everything else was blank and dark. He headed for horse and the Indians to get around the herd before the Reds should reach it. Well, that's a bit racist. I apologize. Trigger warning. One Indian, naked like the others, having only a cloth around the loins, passed him, flying to catch Thomas. Joseph reached the head of the herd and succeeded in turning the cattle up the ravine just as the Indians approached. His efforts, coupled with the rush and yells of the Indians, stampeded the herd up the valley, followed by Joseph, who, by keeping his horse on the dead run, succeeded for some time in keeping between the herd and the Indians. Here was a picture: the boy, the cattle, the Indians, headed on a run for the settlement. Finally, the Reds cut him away from the herd, whereupon he turned, going downstream a distance, then circling around the ravine to the right, to reach the cattle from the side. He had not gone far in that direction when other Indians were seen. They started for him, overtaking him as he emerged from the valley, and still spurred his horse, going at full speed. and while thus riding, 2 of the naked reds closed up behind him in the wild race, and took him, while the horses were going at full speed, one by the left arm and the other by the right leg, and lifted him from the saddle, for a moment holding him in the air, and then suddenly dropping him to the ground. Undoubtedly he would have been scalped but for the timely appearance of a company of men going to the hayfields on the opposite side of the ravine, which scared the thieving Indians away, they having obtained both the boys' horses for their pains. In the meantime Thomas had given the alarm. 2 relief companies were formed in the settlement, one a posse of horsemen under Hosea Stout, who went up the canyon and found the cattle with Alden Burdick, the pursuing Indians having abandoned the chase from fright, while the other took the bench route and discovered Joseph, who with them spent the day in a fruitless search for the Indians and the cattle supposed to have been stolen. I remember on my way home, says Joseph, how I sat down and wept for my cattle, and how the thought of meeting Mother, who would not now go to the valley, wrung my soul with anguish. But happily his bravery and fidelity to trust, which are indissolubly woven with his character as a man, had saved the herd. Leaving winter quarters in the spring of 1848, they reached the Salt Lake Valley on September 23rd, Joseph driving 2 yoke of oxen with a heavily loaded wagon the whole distance. He performed all the duties of a day watchman, herdsman, and teamster, with other requirements imposed upon the men. Arriving in the valley, he again had charge of the herds, interchanging with such labors as plowing, canyon work, harvesting, and fencing. I believe that they mean building fences, yes? Anyway, during this whole time he never lost an animal entrusted to his care, and notwithstanding the numerous large wolves abounding in the valley. I'm going to pause here just for a second because we're going to be changing subjects. But I had heard that story, and I think I've seen a picture like someone has drawn of what it may have looked like. And like just that idea of somebody grabbing him by the arm and the leg and just like lifting him off of his horse. Like when they're all running in the same direction, like that's just like crazy to me. And he was just a kid, you know? I mean, he was like, it must have been really frightening for sure. But just how upset he was and how concerned he was about keeping the cattle for his mother. I feel like he took very good care of his mother. I don't think he was the youngest in his family. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I feel like he was very responsible considering that he had 4 older siblings. Yeah, I just find that very interesting. All right, I do apologize for the racist terms. That is, like, I want to say that's the terms they used then, but calling them Reds is not so great. Yeah, I'm not a fan of that at all. So I apologize for the racist language that was used in 1900, and I wish that they had been more sensitive to, I mean, you can call these men who were trying to steal the cattle renegades, and you can call them thieves. That's fine. They were being thieves. But, like, calling them Reds, I think, is a little much. Like, come on, people. Like, Native Americans, you can use the term. I just feel like using a color to indicate a race is not great. Anyways. Moving on. His education was obtained from his mother, who early taught him in the tent, in the camp, on the prairie, to read from the Bible. He has had no other save that sterner education gathered from the practical pages of life. Really? He didn't go to school? That's really surprising to me. I mean, even if his mother kind of homeschooled him, he clearly knows how to read. But, like, that's all? You know? I mean, you think about your education now, where you learn history and geography and, you know, mathematics and science and, you know, all these things. He missed out on all of those, and I know that you can learn a lot of those from books just by reading them, but, like, you have to have the motivation to do it, you know? That's part of what school is for, is to motivate you to do it, yeah? Okay, but his opportunities in later years have not gone unused, and there are few college-bred men who delight more in books than Joseph. Well, that's good. I mean, he liked to read then. He is, too, a fair judge of the manner and matter of books. His leisure for reading is limited, owing to his constant employment in the affairs of the church, but he loves to read books of history, philosophy, science, and has specially delighted in such authors as Seiss, and Samuel Smiles, lots of S's, who may be said to be his favorites. I haven't heard of either of these authors, but I do love that he wanted to read history, philosophy, and science in particular, because having no schooling means that he was completely missing those. Let's see if I can find this. Seiss, author, Joseph A. Seiss, was an American theologian and Lutheran minister. He was known for his religious writings are pyramidology and dispensationalism. Those are interesting words. Okay, that kind of makes sense to me. So he was a religious person, and since so was Joseph F. Smith, that makes sense. Samuel Smiles. Okay, Samuel Smiles was a British author and government reformer. Although he campaigned on a Chartist platform, he promoted the idea that more progress would come from the new attitudes than from new laws. His primary work, Self-Help, printed in 1859, promoted thrift and claimed that poverty was caused largely by irresponsible habits, while also attacking materialism and laissez-faire government. It has been called the Bible of the mid-Victorian liberalism and has had long-lasting effects on British political thought. Interesting. Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me as well, that he would enjoy reading that. Okay. So that's a little glimpse into people who influenced him the most, considering he never went to school. That still blows my mind. Like, because even back then, pretty much all children went to school, like, at least for a few years. The fact that he didn't go at all is like, wow, really? It just blows my mind. Anyways, in 1852, his mother died, leaving him an orphan at the age of 14. Yep, heard that. It's interesting because, we read George Buchanan last week. Yeah? And he was an orphan at 15 and was basically raised by John Taylor. And if I am not mistaken, I think Brigham Young took quite an interest in Joseph F. Smith. So, these people were basically raised by prophets. You think about that, it's like, wow, that's kind of impressive, yeah? All right. When 15 years of age, he, with other young men, was called on his first mission to the Sandwich Islands, and I believe he became semi-famous in the area at the time. The incidents of the journey to the coast by horses, his work in the mountains at a shingle mill for means to proceed, and the embarkment and journey on the vaquero for the islands are sufficient for a long article in themselves. While his labor in the Maui Conference under President F.A. Hammond, his efforts to learn the language in the district of Kula, and his attack of sickness, the most severe of his life, caused by the Panama fever, and his other labors and varied, trying experiences while there would fill a volume. Yeah, I've heard that. I believe that sickness that he had, he was nursed back to health basically by a woman who he became quite close to, kind of a mother figure. Also remember that he didn't have a mother at the time. Like, he was an orphan. So I think it makes sense that he would latch on to someone else as a motherly figure, or fatherly figure. He says, of the many gifts of the Spirit which were manifest through my administration, next to my acquirement of the language, the most prominent was perhaps the gift of healing, and the power of God, the casting out of evil spirits, which frequently occurred. One incident shows how the Lord is with his servants. Joseph was studying the language, being alone with a native family in Wailuku. One night, while he sat by a dismal light poring over his books in one corner of the room, where dwelt a native and his wife, the woman was suddenly possessed. She arose and, looking toward Joseph, made the most fearful noises and gestures, accompanied by terrible physical contortions. Her husband came on his bended knees and crouched beside him, frightened to trembling. The fear that our young missionary felt under these circumstances was something indescribable, but presently it all left him, and he stood up, facing the maniac woman, exclaiming, "In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, I rebuke you." Like a flash, the woman fell to the floor like one dead. The husband went to ascertain if she were alive and pronounced her dead. Okay. Then he returned and set up a perfect howl, which Joseph likewise rebuked. What should Joseph do? His first impression was to get away from his horrid surroundings, but upon reflection he decided that such action would not be wise. His feelings were indescribable, but having rebuked the evil, it was subdued, and peace was restored, and he proceeded again with his studies. These are the class of experiences that bring a lone missionary, young as he was, close to the Lord. They didn't resolve it, though. Like, was she dead? How did she just die like that? Like that, I'm actually speechless. Because, like, what happened medically, I have no idea. If anybody has any idea besides nothing, like, please leave it in the comments below. But I have no clue what that was supposed to be. I find that very puzzling. Like, what in the world? Okay, so if you have any insights, please leave them in the comments below. I'm a little baffled there. Returning in 1858, he joined the militia, which intercepted Johnston's army, serving until the close of hostilities under Colonel Thomas Callister. He was later chaplain of Colonel Heber P. Kimball's regiment, with the rank of captain. He took part in many Indian expeditions and was in every sense a Minuteman in the Utah militia. Okay. Yeah, a lot of people were at the time, yeah. In the spring of 1860, he was sent on a mission to Great Britain, driving a 4-mule team over the plains for his passage. On this mission, he served nearly 3 years, returning in the summer of 1863. It was here that the intimacy between President George Buchanan, who presided over the mission, and Joseph F. Smith began. See, and they have a lot in common, yeah? Like, George Buchanan immigrated from England, and his parents died on the way over, basically, when he was a teenager. And, like Joseph F. Smith, who had very famous parents from church standards, was also an orphan. Like, I feel like they would have bonded over that for sure. How much they missed their parents, and, how weird it was trying to be raised by nobody, like, do your best. So, friendship and love for each other were engendered, which have since grown stronger through the intimate careers of 2 beautiful lives. Yeah, see, it makes sense to me that they were friends, really does. On his return, President Young proposed at the priesthood meeting that Joseph and his cousin Samuel each be given a present of $1,000 to begin life with. That is amazing. Who just does that? Like, $1,000 back then would have been so much more today. Oh my gosh. When was that? 1863. Returning in the summer of 1863, so that must have been around then. $1 in 1863 is worth $25.13 today. So, well, it's easy math. Yeah, it's $1,000. So it would be $25,130. Like, if somebody just gave you $25,000 just to start life with, like, that's I would have been speechless. I would have been so grateful. Like, I didn't have anything when I started life as an adult, that would just be amazing. So I can't believe that Brigham Young just did that. I mean, was that church money or was that his money? Because I can't actually tell by this statement. He proposed it at a priesthood meeting, so I'm assuming it may have been church money. Interesting. Why would he do that? I find that very interesting. Why didn't the church do that to me? No, I'm just kidding. But like I can't even fathom that happening today. Wow. President Smith realized in the neighborhood of $75 in provisions and merchandise, but mostly a legacy of much annoyance from certain people who entertained the current belief that he had thus obtained a small fortune. Well, I mean, to a certain extent, for the time and for how old he was, he kind of did. Yeah? I mean, an 18-year-old or however old he was, or 20, with $25,000 out of nowhere, yeah, that would be kind of a big deal. Yeah, I agree. With the exception of the cost of his passage and stage fare home, which was sent him by his aunt Mercy R. Thompson, amounting to about $100, he paid his own expenses throughout. as he had done on previous missions. President Smith had been too busy with his work to make money, and his temporal affairs are a strong testimony to his exclusive devotion to the public good. So what they're trying to say is, he didn't squander his money. It's fine. So, good for him. He had only been at home a short time when in the early spring of 1864 he was called to accompany Ezra T. Benson and Lorenzo Snow on a second mission to the Sandwich Islands to regulate the affairs of that mission, which had been greatly disarranged by the well-known shrewd and covetous actions of Walter M. Gibson. In this mission, he acted as principal interpreter for the apostles. They mentioned this exact trip in the article about Lorenzo Snow, so where Lorenzo Snow actually basically drowned in the sea and had to be resuscitated. So, it was this trip. So Joseph F. Smith went with them specifically to translate. He was translating for them into Hawaiian. In this mission, he acted as principal interpreter for the apostles. After Gibson was excommunicated from the church, Joseph was left in charge of the mission, and W. W. Clough and Alma L. Smith as his fellow laborers. It was many months after Gibson had been cut off before his people left his jurisdiction and returned to the standard of the church. Among the works accomplished by Joseph and his associates on this mission was the selection of the Laie plantation as a gathering place for the saints, which was afterwards, on their recommendation, purchased by a committee sent for that purpose by President Young, and which has proven a valuable possession for the mission and for the church in a general way. Joseph and his aides returned in the winter of 1864-65. So far I haven't heard that he'd gotten married, so I'm assuming he's still single at this point. It was while on this mission that a drowning incident occurred mentioned in Whitney's sketch of President Snow. Yeah, I mentioned that. President Smith's part in the affair has never been told. The ship upon which they arrived lay anchored in the channel in which the sea was nearly always rough. A breakwater had been built under shelter of which the natives skillfully steered their boats ashore. There was much danger, however, in approaching it. When it was proposed that the party should land in the ship's unwieldy freight boat, President Smith strongly opposed the proposition, telling the brethren that at the breakwater there was great danger of capsizing. The boat being clumsy old tub, unfit for such a load, he refused to go ashore, and tried to prevail upon the others to abandon the attempt until a better boat can be obtained. He offered to go to shore alone, and to return with a safer boat to land the party. Oh, he was going to swim? So persistent, however, were some of the brethren that he was chided for his waywardness, and one of the apostles even told him, "Young man, you would be better to obey counsel." But he reiterated his impression of danger, refusing positively to land in that boat, and again offering to go alone for a better boat. But the brethren persisted, whereupon he asked that they leave their satchels with their clothes and valuables on the anchored ship with him, and that he be permitted to stay. Wow, that's interesting. So he was the only voice saying, "Don't go. No, don't do this. This is really dangerous." Yeah. This they reluctantly consented to do and set out for land. Joseph stood upon the ship and saw them depart, filled with the greatest apprehension for their safety. When the party reached the breakwater, he saw one of the great waves suddenly overturn the boat. Yeah, he warned him, dropping the company into 20 or 30 feet of water. A boat came out from shore manned with natives who set to work to gather them up and obtained all but President Snow. When the boat which picked them up started for land, it was then that Elder W. W. Clough demanded that they return for Brother Snow, who would otherwise have been abandoned and left for drowned. Wow! Gosh, no wonder he needed to be resuscitated. He was found and dragged into the boat for dead, being thus saved by Brother Clough. All this time, Joseph stood in the greatest agony as a witness, helpless on the deck of the ship. Yeah, that must have been rough. His first information of his companion's fate came from some passing natives who replied to his inquiry that one of the men, Brother Snow, was dead. But through the blessings of God and self-effort, it was, fortunately, not quite so serious, his life having been restored. Joseph had saved himself and the satchels, and he had always considered that while the brethren faithfully said of the incident it was to be, that a prevention in this case would have been much better than a cure. He's not wrong, right? The incident illustrates two predominating traits in his character. When he is convinced of the truth, he is not afraid to express himself in its favor to any man on earth. When he does express himself, it is often with such earnestness and vigor that there is frequently danger of his giving offense. Wow. So he can be really forceful when he's like, "No, this absolutely has to be done this way." Well, good for him. I mean, he was trying to save their lives if they had listened to him. I mean, he was the one who was there who had experience, right, with the area. He knew the area better than they did. So if he's saying this boat is not going to make it to shore, then why didn't they just say, like, oh, if you say so, okay, so what else should we do? And he said, get a different boat. Yeah, this boat is not good enough for this. And he was right. Yeah, he was right. So good for him. I mean, I'm really kind of proud of him for standing up to people who clearly outranked him in different ways, like not in a military way, but like, I mean, people above him in rank. Yeah? I mean, he was there with Lorenzo Snow, for heaven's sake. And Lorenzo Snow was like, no, we're going to go in this boat. And Joseph F. Smith was like, no, don't use this boat. Don't. And he was kind of semi-rude, and people were like, no, stop being rude. You're being rude. But he was right. I didn't know that was what he did. On his return home, he labored in the church's historian office for a number of years, also as clerk in the endowment house, succeeding Elder John V. Long in that capacity, being in charge after the death of President Young until it was closed. He had been ordained an apostle under the hands of President Young on July 1st, 1866, and on 8th October 1867, he was appointed to fill a vacancy in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Okay, just as a quick explanation, especially at this time, but even in later times, it sometimes occurred that someone was ordained an apostle but wasn't part of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles until a vacancy came up. That happened to more than one person. So it's sometimes difficult to know which date to include if you're saying, like, when he became, like, an apostle. Do you mean when he was ordained an apostle, or when he joined the Quorum of the 12? Because those are two different dates. You know, he was ordained an apostle on the 1st of July, 1866, and he became part of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles on October 8th, 1867. So it was like a year and a little bit later. So that did happen not only to him, but several others as well. Brigham Young Jr., I believe, and I want to say Albert Carrington, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And there was at least one other one that I can't remember the name of from the early 20th century, like 1930s. I can't think of it right now, but yeah. But it has happened. It's not unprecedented. It could still happen today if they wanted to do that, but they probably won't because they probably won't. Anyways, they haven't done it in like 100 years, but maybe 85. Anyways, it's been a while. In the year following, he was sent with Apostle Wilford Woodruff and Elder A.O. Smoot to Utah County and served one term in the Provo City Council. Yeah, that's a little irrelevant, isn't it? On February 28, 1874, he went on his second mission to England, where he presided over the European mission, returning in 1875, after the death of President George A. Smith. On his return, he was appointed to preside over the Davis stake until the spring of 1877. Yeah, that was also a thing back then, is that they sometimes had apostles serve as stake presidents. It wasn't super common, but there were a couple who did more than once. Lorenzo Snow was the president of Box Elder Stake, and in this case, Joseph F. Smith was president of Davis Stake until the spring of 1877. So not super long, but yeah, he definitely was. When he left on his third British mission, having first witnessed the dedication of the first temple in the Rocky Mountains at St. George, April 1877, he arrived in Liverpool, May 27th, and was joined a short time afterwards by Apostle Orson Pratt, who had been sent to publish new editions of the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. When news arrived of the death of President Young, they were released, arriving home September 27th. Oh, it was the same year, wasn't it? 1877. Yeah, that's right. In August of the following year, he was sent with Apostle Orson Pratt on a short Eastern mission, visiting noted places in the history of the Church in Missouri, Ohio, New York, and Illinois. It was on this trip that they had their famous interview with David Whitmer. Oh yeah, that was published, yeah. When the first presidency was organized in October 1880, he was chosen as second counselor to President John Taylor, who died July 25, 1887. He was chosen to the same position in the presidency under President Woodruff, and holds it at present under President Snow. Yes, this is a bit confusing if you're not familiar with it. So when President Taylor chose his counselors for the first presidency, he chose George Buchanan as his first counselor and Joseph F. Smith as his second counselor. And then, after he died and that dissolved the first presidency, Wilford Woodruff called George Buchanan as his first counselor and Joseph F. Smith as his second counselor. Yeah. And then after he died in 1898, then Lorenzo Snow became president of the church, and he chose George Buchanan as his first counselor and Joseph F. Smith as his second counselor. They served together in the first presidency for what felt like generations. They were called in, 1880 with John Taylor, and they served all together in that constellation until 1901, when George Buchanan passed away. But it wasn't until then that the constellation actually changed. I think of it as kind of a Gordon B. Hinckley as first counselor and Thomas S. Monson as second counselor kind of a constellation, because they served under Ezra Taft Benson and Howard W. Hunter in that same constellation as well. So, I mean, it's kind of in that same vein, so to speak. It's similar. But yeah, it felt like generations. I guess it wasn't that long, 21 years. But that's still kind of a decent stretch for a certain first presidency constellation, even though the president changed. Yeah? You saw the same first and second counselor. So I did know that. And then at the time that this was written in 1900, it was still the case. Yeah? George Buchanan as first president, as first counselor, and Joseph S. Smith as second. It would take too much space to name his various civil positions held in Salt Lake City and in the legislature of the territory, where he served the people long and faithfully. All my readers are familiar with the work of his recent years. It is like an open book to the whole people. So he has been constantly in the service of the public, and by his straightforward course he has won the love, confidence, and esteem of the whole community. He is a friend of the people, is very easily approached, a wise counselor, a man of broad views, and contrary to first impressions, is a man whose sympathies are easily aroused. Contrary to first impressions. Oh, that's interesting. So he gives off maybe a distant, kind of a cold first impression, maybe? But he's actually a man whose sympathies are easily aroused? Interesting. He is a reflex of the best character of the Mormon people, inured to hardships, patient in trial, God-fearing and self-sacrificing, full of love for the human race, powerful in moral, mental, and physical strength. President Joseph F. Smith has an imposing physical appearance. Yeah, they said that, yeah. Now completing his 62nd year, he is tall, erect, well-knit, and symmetrical in build. You know, I don't think those are words I ever used to describe a person. Well-knit and symmetrical in build. Sure. He has a prominent nose and features. Yeah, you can see that in his photos. Yeah. When speaking, he throws his full, clear, brown eyes wide open on the listener, who may readily perceive from their penetrating glimpse the wonderful mental power of the tall forehead above. He has brown eyes? Well, he must have got them from his mother, because I'm pretty sure Hiram Smith had blue eyes. Yeah. His large head. He has a large head. Okay, his large head is crowned with an abundant growth of hair. Oh, that's true, he didn't go bald, yeah. In his early years dark, but now, like his full beard, tinged with a liberal sprinkling of gray. Yeah, sprinkling is kind of an understatement. In conversation, one is forcibly impressed with the sudden changes in appearance of his countenance. Under the different influences of his mind, now intensely pleasant, with an enthusiastic and childlike interest in immediate subjects and surroundings. Now absent, the mobility of his features set in that earnest, almost stern majesty of expression so characteristic of his portraits, so indicative of the severity of the conditions and environments of his early life. As a public speaker, his leading trait is an intense earnestness. He impresses the hearer with his message more from the sincerity of its delivery and the honest earnestness of his manner than from any learned exhibition of oratory or studied display of logic. He touches the hearts of the people with the simple eloquence of one who is himself convinced of the truths presented. He is a pillar of strength in the church, thoroughly imbued with the truths of the gospel and the divine origin of this work. His whole life and testimony are an inspiration to the young. I said to him, You knew Joseph the prophet. You are old in the work of the church. What is your testimony to the youth of Zion concerning these things? And he replied, slowly and deliberately, I was acquainted with the prophet Joseph in my youth. I was familiar in his home, with his boys, and with his family. I have sat on his knee. I have heard him preach, distinctly remember being present in the council with my father and the prophet Joseph Smith and others. From my childhood to youth, I believed him to be a prophet of God. From my youth until the present, I have not believed that he was a prophet, for I have known that he was. In other words, my knowledge has superseded my belief. I remember seeing him dressed in military uniform at the head of the Nauvoo Legion. I saw him when he crossed the river, returning from his intended western trip into the Rocky Mountains to go to his martyrdom, and I saw his lifeless body, together with that of my father, after they were murdered in Carthage jail, and still have the most palpable remembrance of the gloom and sorrow of those dreadful days. I believe in the divine mission of the prophets of the 19th century with all my heart, and in the authenticity of the Book of Mormon and the inspiration of the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, and hope to be faithful to God and man, and not false to myself, to the end of my days. Edward H. Anderson. Wow. So the reason they didn't mention him as a president of the church is because he wasn't yet. Yeah. He became president of the church, I want to say, it was after Heber J. Grant, wasn't it? No. He was the next one, 1901. Yeah? I'm pretty sure it was 1901. Let me just double check that. Fact checking myself. Yeah, 1901. 17 October. Yeah. So it was actually soon after this was written, even though they didn't know it at the time. Another year and a half. Another year and 10 months, I guess. But yeah, like that hadn't happened yet when they wrote this article. So we are just seeing a glimpse of what they knew at the time of writing, 1900, February 1900. So, but I find that very interesting. I also don't think that I had actually heard that particular testimony from Joseph F. Smith. If it's probably relatively well known, but let me know if you had heard it before. That was really powerful, because of course he knew him. You know, he was his nephew, and his father and uncle died when he was 6. He was born in 1938, and November 38, so he was only 5. So he turned 6 after his father's death, but he remembers it. He remembers it very distinctly. That's really remarkable, I think. Having that sharp of a memory of that event, and I'm sure it was trauma-induced, but however, I do still think it's impressive. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed that, I found that very interesting, and I did learn quite a few things. I didn't realize that he was so vehemently opposed to Lorenzo Snow and company's trip to shore in that little boat that ended up capsizing. He's like, no, not here. We don't do this here. No. And nobody really listened to him. They're like, come on, dude. We know better than you. And he's like, no, really, this is bad. This is not good at all. Don't do it. Yeah. Interesting to me that he's friendlier than he looks. It almost makes me think he might have a touch of autism, because, or just at least like a very resting, face, resting grumpy face, yeah, because, I don't know, I feel like, I only say autistic because many autistic people have trouble with facial expressions and can appear more severe than they are, might even appear angry or sad, just because they're just neutral. They're just sitting there, just not being emotional, and people will come up to them and ask them if they're angry. At least, you know, people that I have known. Anyways, so let me know what you think in the comments below. And next week we will continue the same series. So I hope to see you then. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.